Tell him not to turn his camera.
All right. Well, welcome to the Research Community Work Panel. My name is Jared Evans, part of the Air Force Ventures team. And today we're going to speak to not only a very esteemed panel of experts from a variety of perspectives, but we're going to talk about really how we as Air Force Ventures engage the community to a deeper level, specifically in the research realm, in terms of the programs that we are providing to the research community and the ways we are going about in just the broader engagement, understanding the government perspective, understanding the company and research perspective, and ultimately having a more effective and efficient engagement throughout the up and downstream effects of research, whether that be commercialization into the commercial sector, clearly, or in the government unique perspective as well.
What I just did is I sent my feed, so the program feed, to the Zoom call.
One of the things that we wanted to do in setting up this perspective is understanding the
here you won't see it because I turned myself off.
I'll make sure that you can hear me. I'm getting a little background feedback here. So we'll make sure we take care of it. But first of all, we want to kind of set up the discussion and understand where we are as a government and our market share in the R&D or in the R&D ecosystem, right? We've got a variety of charts here that kind of show some of the perspective here. And when we take the chart on the left, for instance, when we look at the U.S. R&D budget, and when we look at the applied and basic research spaces, the blue line being the federal, the orange line being the business, we have another category that includes government agencies at the state level and a variety of other players as well. We see that the interaction from, as we move from the 1960s through the early 2000s and today, the government really has a pretty sharp downward trend relative to the business sector. And when you look at globally, a global perspective, on the top right chart there, you can see us moving from 1967 to 1997 and onwards, right, going from 19% to 7% to 4% of the global market share for the R&D. And it's really important that we understand and that our perspectives from a government view really evolves to reflect the reality of our situation currently, right? For instance, the Chinese government in particular, right, we don't even necessarily see on the Cold War circle graph on the left-hand side there, but we can see a significant growth there from 3% to 27%, excuse me, in a more recent perspective there. And even on that third chart on the bottom right, we can see that the Chinese growth in R&D is catching up, and in the business case has actually exceeded the U.S. contributions in that area particularly. So what we see now is that we are in a distinctly different situation than we have been in previous decades, right? And when you look at the R&D policy, when you look at the R&D spending, there is some acknowledgement of that reality, but many of the programs, whether it be STTR or otherwise, are still grounded in the mentality of the early 1990s, of the 1970s, and even 1980s in some cases. What we want to make sure that we do is provide, as Air Force Ventures, is provide a variety of opportunities, right? Modern, updated, evolving opportunities that are reactive to the market, as it were, but are also empathetic to the research community in particular. One of the ways that we're trying to do that through the STTR program in particular is this open topic construct. Now, you've heard in previous sessions with Jason and Steve talking about phase 1, phase 2, and then moving into TACFI and STRACFI. And the STTR process takes advantage of that system as well. So $50,000 for phase 1 to find those early adopters, right? Moving into phase 2 and $750K over 15 months. And then one of the things that we haven't seen in STTR before is taking advantage of the TACFI and STRACFI programs. Now, if you're not familiar with TACFI or STRATFI, do stay tuned. Steve will actually be talking about this later this afternoon in more detail and talk about some of the really exciting updates that we're seeing with that program. But one of the things I do want to touch base with STTR For those who aren't familiar, you have a small business who submits a proposal, but they also have to bring in a mandatory research institution that accounts for between 30 and 60% of the proposed work. And with that mandatory subcontractor, not only do we have an alleviation of having to have sales or having to have commercial traction, as you would see with the SBIR program, but you also have special caveats in terms of the definition of what a research institution is, whether that be universities, whether that be nonprofits, whether that be FFRDCs, as well as policy caveats that have existed this entire time in terms of the principal investigator being able to be employed by the small business, as you would expect, but also by the research institution. So there's a lot of flexibility in this program that's built in that is distinctly serving the research communities, but there's a variety of other tools as well. And we're going to talk about those here just briefly prior to our panel. But ultimately, so now what, right? We understand that we as a government entity make up a much smaller percentage of the R&D budget, and we have a relatively smaller influence in that as well. But how do we empathize more with the research community to make our programs more effective? How do we take the resources that we have and make them more valuable to the community? And also, how do we deliberately orient our strategy such that we not only leverage our resources and our influence that we directly connect, but we also have strategic partners, right, that we can bounce off of and utilize to maximum effect, right? Ultimately, our goal here is to provide value to the research community such that we can lay the technology and scientific backgrounds that our processes and technologies and products later on can be built off of. So with that, I want to introduce our panel members for today. First of all, Colonel Jason Mello, Ms. Kristen Hajduk, and Mr. John Pirovilakis. And ladies and gentlemen, as we kind of step into our panel here, I want to kind of open up with a question in terms of your role in the research community and how your organizations can leverage the partnerships with the government and with the research communities that we serve. So we'll start with Colonel Mello and then move to Kristen and John following that.
Okay, thank you, Jared. Well, first, I just want to thank everyone and thank for my fellow panel members and a great opportunity for AFWERX and Air Force Ventures to be doing this. Outreaching to the community and being able to showcase what we do within the Office of Scientific Research is really, in my mind, a groundbreaking really just I would say opportunity. So what I like to do is I just want to highlight a few things so if folks don't understand what we do within Air Force Office of Scientific Research. We are part of, as you can see up on my background, we are part of the Air Force Research Laboratory. We're one of the technical directorates located in Arlington, Virginia. And really our mission within AFWERX is to discover, shape, basic research for the entire Department of the Air Force. And that includes now with not just the Air Force side, but also the Space Force. So that's something that's new in the sense of having a new formal department stand up or service stand up within the department. And that's something that we are readily and we're very happy to serve and to continue to support. AFWERX has a long history of supporting basic research for the Air Force, going back well over 60 years, almost 70 years. And this research, one of the things that I'll just read here, from one of our first generals, General Hap Arnold, was the first essential of air power necessary for our national security is a preeminence in research. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. When we look at where we start everything within AFWERX and what we're charged to do within Air Force Research Laboratory is to look at and how do we fund basic research. And what we're trying to do across within, not just my division, but I work very closely within AFWERX with our other colonel who leads the international office. So we have a global perspective on looking at research that could benefit the Air Force and the Space Force. And that's really important because, within our area, we have 36 science portfolios specific to, both biology, chemistry, the physical sciences, and the engineering side of the house too. So it's a very diverse, I would say, set of programs, if I could say it that way, kind of portfolio of programs. It's kind of not really looked as a true acquisition program firm, say, so that a lot of people look at, but we're really trying to build the foundational basic research for the Air and the Space Force. And when we look at that, we have a proud history. So we've looked at from stealth technologies to numerous things from within being some of the pioneers in that area. What the challenge that I think Jared alluded to in the previous charts is how do we start to relook at the way we do business? Because when we look at, budgets declining, but we also look at our adversaries, how do we partner? How do we end up looking at basic research specifically with the universities, with the other agencies? And that's something that's on the forefront of our leadership within AFWERX, but even across AFRL. It's important that we try to look at that and determine how do we set really a basis for developing what we need to invest in and how do we move forward with it. And I think, there's a number of different programs that we have internally to AFWERX because we are responsible for the entire basic research program for the Department of the Air Force. We work very closely with AFRL and the tech directorates for each of the specialties. But at the end of the day, we are responsible for pulling together that entire program and working with the other agencies, both in the Navy, the Army, but also the NSF, et cetera, to determine how do we do that. So with the tailored approach, it's really important that we look at how do we take it to the next step, because if we're doing basic research for the Department of the Air Force, we need to determine what's the next step. How do we move it forward? How do we get it transitioned? I can tell you, just going back to, when I was a second lieutenant on active duty in a research laboratory, one of the challenges that I saw very early on is how do we do all this great research, but how do we transition it? And how do we make sure it's value added? How do we make sure at the end of the day, we're able to tie that, pull that string all the way and to get to where it's a capability or getting to a program or a system that is going to really change the environment of how we move forward. So I guess that's just a summary of kind of what we do, kind of where some of my initial thoughts are, but I'm going to end it there. And Jared, I'll turn it back over to you or whoever you like to go next.
Sure. Thanks so much, Colonel Mello. We really appreciate the comments there. Over to Kristen. I know Ensign has a really compelling network of university contacts there on the ground at the institutions and a variety of other tools that you use. Can you talk more about the National Security Innovation Network and how you interact with the research community?
Sure. So thanks for including me today. I'm really excited to have the discussion. The National Security Innovation Network resides within the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And our mission is to create pathways and connections with what we call non-traditional innovators, simply because the department doesn't generally think of universities and startup ecosystems first when they're thinking about outside technologies. So what we have done is we've created a networked team. We take that word very seriously here. And my team is situated all across the country, and they are on the front lines of developing local relationships with universities across the country. Jared, you spent some time at Stanford. Colonel Mello, you spent some time at UMass Lowell. John, you spent some time at NYU. We have Ensign programs running at each of those institutions today. And we are very lucky to have partnerships with over 60 universities across the country. And really what we talk to universities about is sharing DoD problems with universities. Sometimes researchers simply don't understand what the DoD need is and what those use cases might be. And so one of the steps that we've taken that's somewhat unusual is that every problem that we source from the department must be unclassified, right? Because the moment you make something classified, you're automatically counting out a lot of folks that could lend their expertise to your problem set. So we take those unclassified problems, and the other step that we've taken is we can take problems from anyone in the department, no matter what their rank or what their organization is. So we've had the good fortune to work very closely with both AFWERX and AFRL and AFOSR, but we work across all of the services as well. So anyone that has a pain point, anyone whose job could be made easier by innovation technology, if they come to us and they're willing to sponsor an Ensign program, then we collaborate with them. And then I think, what we have done with our programs is we've created about half a dozen programs that are specifically geared towards universities. Universities have certain incentives, they have certain needs, they have their own equities that they have to consider. And so we have built programs that are tailored to fit into those needs, whether it be offer them more partnerships and more connections with the university. One of our most well-known programs, as you know, is called Hacking for Defense. And the basic purpose of that program is that the students get to interview between 80 and 100 DoD folks as a matter of learning more about the problem and finding solutions. And so for a university, that's 80 to 100 new connections. And so, by being open and being transparent and helping create those pathways, we're finding ways to bring DoD to universities in a way that's both beneficial for the person in the department that has the need, as well as the university, as well as the student. In many cases, we find that our programs are the first instance that a university student has with anyone in the department. And so you can imagine that experiential learning does a lot to open the students' eyes to really the breadth and depth of what the department's needs are in terms of technology. Students don't understand that we have a lot of humanitarian assistance and disaster response needs. We have a lot of medical tech needs. And then, for many students, because they're able to participate in Ensign programs, because they're able to learn more about the department and learn and meet more folks in the department, they actually consider working for the department as part of their career path. So we're sort of creating and layering incentives when we bring these entities together and when we create those pathways.
That's excellent. No, we really appreciate the contribution from Ensign and the really the enormous magnitude of experience and resources that they bring to the fight. And I think you highlighted a really important point in terms of understanding the Department of Defense from a variety of aspects, right? Our applications, our technologies, organization, and really some of the basic aspects of how they can engage with us. I want to make sure we get over to John and understand his perspective from both the nonprofit and the kind of the VC side of the house. How do you engage with the research ecosystem, and what services and value do you bring to the community as a whole?
Well, Jared, thanks for having me. And it's intimidating speaking for such wonderful predecessors to this. But so I'll answer that first by introducing our organization. So I'm from Innovation Accelerator Foundation. Our mission, so we're a 501c3. We're a philanthropy. We're not part of the U.S. government. But our mandate and our mission pertains to supporting the U.S. government. Our mission is to promote American military and economic strength globally by promoting American innovation. And it's sort of been bouncing around the space for a long time. As I heard Colonel and Kristen speak, I thought it sort of changed my perspective on things that I've touched on. But we got our start actually supporting a civilian agency, the National Science Foundation. We started a program at the time called Innovation Accelerator Initiative, before the term Accelerator was a formal term. It was a precursor to NSF Corps. That was maybe one of the most gratifying experiences of my life. We basically worked to expand our portfolio to affect better commercial outcomes. And we got our sort of first big break when the President's Council of Advisors on Science Technology saw fit to recommend us in a report back to the then President Barack Obama, where basically it credited us with, the report credited us with bringing over $200 million of private sector money into the SBR portfolio we managed on NSF's behalf. And they recommended that our program be adopted across the federal government. And I think this was, so the work was very gratifying, felt very patriotic, but I also found out early on the problems, some of the challenges in dealing with government, because after this glowing recommendation by the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology, and given some of the priority placed on innovation by the NSF at the time, it may be surprising to say now that the response the NSF had to that success was to shut the program down. So that's a whole story in its own right. Some of the companies that we worked with, many of the companies that we worked with at NSF actually also had a DoD of some variety of SBIRs. And some recent high flyers are actually ones we worked with early on, including BitSite, which came out of Lincoln Law at MIT. Exobionics is having problems these days, but it was part of the old project led by Brad Chesper. So that's kind of how we got into the space. Now, as it pertains to this conversation, I really want to talk about an initiative we have called Academic Venture Exchange. Academic Venture Exchange is a cooperative of 34 of the top 40 R&D universities in this country. The participants represent the majority of university startups generated in this country, the majority of licensing revenues, university licensing revenues generated in this country. So this is sort of the mother's milk of university innovation in this country right now. John Soderstrom at Yale, who leads tech transfer at Yale University, and Oren Herzkovitz, who leads tech transfer at Columbia University, were co-founded this with us founding board members. The founding board members now include Nicole Mercier from WashU, and Ken Immergluck most recently from Stanford. And the problem that we address there is what we call the human capital valley of death. So in this set of universities, the primary challenge in getting the ventures out is not so much access to capital. In fact, alums of these schools represent the majority of venture capitalists in the country, right? So the issue is it's not so much having access to capital. The issue is really that the counterparts to the capital providers, to the investors that come to the universities, often are teams that are not fundable in their own right because there's just management in place that is, prepared or qualified to take on professional investment. So our mission, the purpose of our cooperative with universities, is to be a place where the universities can pool not only the best ventures, but their best entrepreneurs into a pool, and we play the role of matchmakers. And I think the fact that we started with 15 schools with the Ivy League schools and have expanded to 34 of the top 40 on a very skinny budget of a couple $100,000 a year says that maybe we did not such a bad job. With some pride, we'll say that we worked a little bit with Kristen, or not so much Kristen, but some of her colleagues to help get an Ensign Spoke set up in Omaha, Nebraska before it became real. When it became real, Kristen made it real. So above my pay grade kind of stuff. So I'm very interested in this discussion because I think that building bridges between the university community and the Department of Defense at this point is a real national security issue. This should be a priority from a defense standpoint. The kind of relationships we've built, the depth of the relationships, all our relationships with the heads of tech transfer, all these universities, 34 of the top 40. This could be a real asset in helping the DoD defend us in this increasingly competitive world. So that's what we've been working on. We've had the good fortune of working with both Air Force and Navy on this project, and hopefully in the coming months we'll have some good announcements, including Ensign. Ensign has been very helpful. So that's kind of what we're about and what we're certainly hoping. I will say, I think as a private foundation, we're in an interesting spot. I think the old model of a just DoD paying for every single thing that's done without private collaboration is hard. I mean, it's our hope that we can attract philanthropic dollars to supporting some defense causes, and we've had a history of that. We're very fortunate to have been the recipients of support from the Suzanne and Walter Scott Foundation. Walter Scott founded that. God bless him. He's a multi-billionaire director of Berkshire Hathaway that has supported our country in many ways, in little ways in his world supporting us. But we think that this kind of private collaboration is very important in achieving some of the public goals that the Department of Defense has, especially in declining DoD money. And the last thing I'll say about this is that it's my hope that we'll be able to prioritize, in particular, things like quantum, hypersonics, cybersecurity. But these are places that historically DoD has led, and I think as we move into this transitional type spot, I think it's important to keep. China announced last week that they have a quantum computer. We may or may not believe that, but that should be very alarming to all of us, I think, that care about these things. I would equate them having a quantum computer first as comparable to getting the first nuclear bomb. I think it's that sort of significant to things. So I applaud everyone for what they're doing here, and I'm eager as my form of service. Anyway, so Jared, I didn't speak too much. I pass the mic back.
No, that's really informative, and thank you so much for walking through that. And I know that I think I was able to hear you okay, but you were breaking up for just a little bit, just for your awareness. We have had a variety of folks join us as participants in the program here. If you have questions that you would like us to answer, certainly we do have a limited amount of time, and that we have to discuss. But if you have questions that you would like answered, we'll certainly try to get to those as we kind of go through the program. So do keep that in mind. There is a chat window for those in the Zoom conference here. So with that, I mean, the panelists here represent a really varied perspective on research, whether that's kind of the basic research, applied research, kind of the business and commercialization side of the equation. And that was by design. And I think one of the things that we run into, especially on the government side, is understanding especially when we talk about kind of ambiguous terms like transition, right? Research isn't always the same. And everyone, depending on who you are and your role and your organization's position in the ecosystem, that transition is going to look and be defined differently. And so one of the things we're curious about is, from your perspective, what does successful transition look like? What are some of the ingredients that researchers or small business owners or someone who's interested in capitalizing in this space, what do they need to make sure that they look for and have prepared in order to make that transition and that journey really more successful? And I think we can we'll start with Kristen and move over to Colonel Mello and then to John.
Sure, yeah, I think I'll answer that in a couple different ways. One is, at Ensign, we really talk about solution adoption. And in order to adopt a solution, typically within the department, you need 3 different ingredients. One, you need someone that is an end user that understands the problem set well. You need a part of the department that has a contract vehicle that's appropriate for the technology. And you need a part of the department that has a budget that's appropriate for that vehicle. And so there's any number of ways to mix and match those 3 things, but those are 3 entities that are required to really, for the department to be able to bring that technology in. And so for us, we are able to sort of reach across the department, try to find who those folks might be, and invite them into the conversation around a particular technology or tech vertical. I think the other thing to think in terms of transition is because we're the department, we always think of transition first as being transition into the department. But I think one of the things that we also try to address is, especially for new tech or tech that's coming out of universities, they also need a lot of private sector investment. And so we really try to support dual use technology for that reason, because even if they don't find a hold within the government for whatever reason, it's still important for us for that technology to thrive. And so, we do what we can to bring in venture, to bring in folks like John, who have that outside perspective and who are also interested in supporting that kind of technology. And we know even if certain technologies are able to get STTRs, for example, Jared, as you discussed earlier in our conversation, that might not be enough for a small company to survive. So, we really try to encourage technology that's coming out of universities or entrepreneurs at universities to really think about how they're going to engage the private sector as well. So, we have an accelerator program that is meant to support transition for technology that's at universities by helping connect them with DoD end users. We also have an acceleration program that's specific for spinning DoD service laboratory IP out into the private sector. As you know, all the service labs have done an amazing amount of work to develop a lot of different kinds of emerging technologies. And sometimes for whatever reason, it doesn't get directly into the hands of the warfighter. So by bringing in entrepreneurs and trying to help them spin out into a private sector company, we know that that technology will continue to thrive, if not inside the department in the short term. So I think there's lots of different ways to think about transition, and we tried to sort of get at all those different angles so that we could sort of address and support the bigger picture.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Colonel Miller, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and you're spot on. I think so. I guess I would take a little different approach. I don't want to repeat anything. Either Chris said. I think it's spot on. I think where we look at it, there's a couple different things that we asked our folks to do. Is the communication piece. I think it was mentioned earlier too, but our communication and communicating what our requirements are, what research we want the universities to do is so important to be able to then lay out a transition pathway to get to what we need to do, whether it's going to be transitioned, whether it's a very basic research, a new algorithm for mathematical equations based on how do you do orbitology, or something that it's really creating that pathway of transition. And that's really what I believe AFWERX, part of with all our program officers within our office, is to try to develop that pathway and to communicate that. But that's a two-way communication. So that's the other key part, is that for all the universities, I've seen a couple of questions in chat, to work with us, we need to also communicate, and it needs to be on both sides. So be able to understand what research is being done and get that communication to us so that we can figure out what the transition is, but also understand from the researcher exactly why they want to do that research. Why are they doing it? Because there always is a linkage that may not be a Department of Defense linkage, but also to the private sector. So there's a lot of things that we have done in AFWERX that link directly to the private sector, which may not have or very little military application, but have a greater good to the nation. And that's a key piece that I know we're always striving to within AFWERX. But and the other key part is, I think John mentioned it, is DoD has led in many of these different areas at one point, but now we're trying to look at how we can partner. So there's areas of research that we don't fund because we know the private sector does it better or has more funding availability. I think one of the things that we need to do better from a transition point within the Air Force is how do we team with private companies? Because at the end of the day, we need to team with companies out there that also have their vision of where they want to go. So how do you pull that research? Because a lot of the major companies are funding research at universities and spending millions and billions of dollars. But it's how do we leverage that capability from other companies, but also reach out to the small businesses and figure out how do we help provide, either that, that additional kind of, government stamp. I hate to use that terminology, but in my past life, I can tell you, when I've put some seed funding into a certain program, it was able to, I had a venture capitalist come after me afterwards and say, hey, without the government giving that initial investment on that technology, we were never invested. And to me, that speaks magnitudes of I don't want to say the power of the government, but at the end of the day, we're looking for those promising technologies and we vet them. So we want to partner more, I think, with the venture capitalists, with private industry, because that's the only way we can, I think, make a difference for our nation and really protect against the threats out there that, seldomly we see, and a lot of people don't understand. So I think that's how I would address that, Jared.
No, that's great. I think there's a few consistent themes here, right? Whether there's the things that the small businesses or the research teams can think through, things that we have to improve on the government side as well. John, over to you. What are some of the right ingredients as someone's thinking of transition and understanding kind of the next phase that they'd like to extend into?
First, I want to say I really, really enjoyed Kristen and Colonel Millo's comments. There's fascinating stuff. Just because they covered so much, I might maybe respond to your question by tweaking it a little bit. I think given some of the circumstances you started with, Jared, about the decline in DoD funding relative to other sources, and also an understanding of the history of our country that Miller just alluded to, in terms of DoD being historically the originator of the really game-changing ideas that have moved it globally. So, going back to nuclear bomb, but also the internet, the communication satellite, the GPS, microprocessor. These are all DoD inventions. So when we talk about what does a successful transition mean, I'd like to, there's a successful transition from the vantage point of making money for a private sector enterprise, including a venture capital fund, and there's a successful transition from the vantage point of helping our country defend itself globally, militarily and economically. And I would say in my life, the difference between those two has never been more pronounced. The disconnect between the kinds of innovations that are getting the kinds of companies and innovations that are getting unicorn valuations, and the kinds of innovations that will actually help us defend ourselves in the future, defend our positions globally relative to China, are very, very different. I think, I guess I say this because I think the venture capital industry in this country is a national treasure. I am a venture capitalist. I've started a venture capital fund. I like my focus better than some of the other folks, but I guess I'm biased. But venture capital is an asset class. Venture capital, it's like fixed income. It's like private equity. It's like bonds, right? So the objective is to make money. It's not to save the country. Now, it sometimes does. It does sometimes results in innovations that help us defend ourselves better. But to be clear, that's not the objective. And I'm raising this point not to be critical of anyone. As I say, I am a venture capitalist myself. But I find the prospect of individual American companies going head to head against nation states that don't have shareholders. They don't have to worry about quarterly reports to the market. They don't have to worry about satisfying LPs. That's an unfair competition. So, I mean, from my vantage point, we have to think about how structurally to start playing around with that interplay between the public and private sector, so that China can't keep manipulating it the way it is to their advantage. We are at real risk of losing if a company, private sector company, that either at the time they do it or later end up being owned by, an organization that is a state-run organization, can go in the front door of any university or any place selling IP and buy what they want, buy their way to AI leadership, buy their way to quantum leadership. So I think transition, I hope in this context, the discussion of transition can be specifically in the context of what's good for our country, as opposed to what is good for a particular asset class that happens to be dominant in this country. The Chinese are, I wrote an article about this in the Hill. I mean, I don't know if it's still true, but at the time I wrote it, the Chinese were on path to have a bigger venture capital industry than we do. All right. And I will say that if Lyft is a great company, a lot of these are, WeWork, these are great companies, but these are not companies that will help us defend ourselves. So just a point of nuance about what transition means. I don't think we can just look at what happens in Silicon Valley and say that'll save us, because it won't. And the core R&D behind quantum, if DoD doesn't do it, or the government doesn't do a lot of it, we're not going to have it done first.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it highlights the importance of partnerships, right? And the fact that, and to the degree that we have to mesh together and work together and align our perspectives and align our incentive structures so that we can, again, maximize the effect of each one of us individually and then us as a group, right? Because, the defense industrial base and the research base, right, that we have in the country is a national asset. And we have to make sure that we're leveraging that to the maximum degree, because as you say, I mean, the competition between a company and a nation state, right, is really just fundamentally unfair, right, for a variety of reasons. So as we kind of close up our time here,
Jared, I just wanted to loop what John said back to our university discussion, which is, I think, one of the really interesting things that we have seen in terms of private sector investment have been university alum angel networks. They're interested in investing in technology that's coming out of the university, and they're also interested in investing in more hardware than your typical Silicon Valley VC. So I think just to bring it back to sort of all of the great resources that universities have that we can, all avail ourselves of in the future.
No, that's perfect, and it's a wonderful segue into kind of the last question here, and I'll pause just briefly. So, if for those of you who are interested in the STTR program specifically and what we're doing and planning to grow here in the next year, we do have presentations on that coming up later in the program, not too long from here in the next few minutes. So please stay tuned for that. And additionally, just here at the very end, I want to start with John, and we'll roll around to Kristen and then to Colonel Mello. Right? If the attendees here want to find out more about your organizations and the value propositions and things that you bring, how would they get in contact and find out more about those resources? Over.
In my case, it's easy. It's John. I don't have my last name in the email, so it makes it a lot easier. But it's just John, JOHN, at avx.io. Apple Vineyard X-ray.io, Italy Orange.
Yeah, I would just say, would love everyone to visit our website. It's nsin.us. And on our map, it has all of the connections for our team that's situated across the country. And you can find more information on how to get a hold of me personally. But we work in the more the merrier models. So the more folks that reach out to us, the better.
I think I put my email in the chat. I think you can send an email, jason.mello, MELLO, at us.af.mil. But you can also, I just do a search, use your favorite search engine, look up AFWERX. The majority, I would say, of our stuff is unclassified, which is fantastic. So from YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, especially on our Twitter site, AFWERX, at AFWERX, a lot of great information, and we're always pushing what technologies we're sponsoring, but there's many ways to get a hold of us.
That's excellent. Well, once again, thank you all so much for being part of the panel this afternoon. Really appreciate your time and getting kind of working through all the logistics and getting through here and kind of giving all of us your perspective on research and some of the questions that we brought up. So thank you so much for your time, and look forward to everyone joining us back on the main channel there. Thanks so much.